Live from London, this is BBC News.
Give us what you stole from us!
King Charles's speech to the Australian Parliament is overshadowed by anti-colonial slogans shouted by an Indigenous senator. Airstrikes across Lebanon as Israel steps up its attacks. This is the scene live in Beirut. The United States Special Envoy Amos Hochstein has arrived in Lebanon to explore ways of negotiating an end to the war between Hezbollah and Israel. Here in the UK, the Prime Minister urges NHS staff to have their say over the future of the health service in England. And also coming up, we find out why Woody, the detection dog, has his nose trained on rats and ferrets in a bid to save the puffins of Rathlin Island. Hello, I'm Anita McVeigh and welcome to BBC News Now. 3 hours of fast-moving news, interviews and reaction. In Australia, King Charles has been heckled by a senator shortly after addressing the Parliament in Canberra. The Indigenous Senator Lidia Thorpe, who's an independent and is known for her opposition to the monarchy, shouted, "You're not my king, and this is not your land," before being escorted away. There's been no official comment from Buckingham Palace on the incident on the second day of the King and Queen Camilla's 9-day trip. But it's drawn further attention to the debate about the monarchy in Australia. Let's take a look now at the protest. With more, here's our senior royal correspondent, Daniela Ralph.
Arriving in Canberra for a day that was always going to touch on this country's difficult history, but the King and Queen were faced with it more directly than planned. At Parliament House in Canberra, they were given a traditional welcome into the Great Hall as the King addressed the gathered politicians and dignitaries.
In my many visits to Australia, I have witnessed the courage and hope that have guided the nation's long and sometimes difficult journey towards reconciliation. Throughout my life, Australia's First Nations peoples have done me the great honour of sharing so generously their stories and cultures. I can only say how much my own experience has been shaped and strengthened by such traditional wisdom.
But as the King finished, the event was interrupted to shouts of "You are not our king."
This is not your land! This is not your land! You are not my king!
The voice of protest was a sitting politician here, Aboriginal Senator Lidia Thorpe. Security removed her from the Great Hall. Outside Parliament, she told the BBC why she'd protested.
I wanted to send a clear message to the King of England that he's not the king of this country. He's not my king. He's not sovereign. We are sovereign. To be sovereign, you have to be of the land. He's not of this land.
Away from the protest, it had been a day when thousands had turned out across Canberra to see the King and Queen, including a lively alpaca. Royal sources said they had been deeply touched to see so many people in Australia's capital. Daniela Ralph, BBC News, Canberra.
And in the last few hours, Senator Thorpe's Instagram account reshared this post, a cartoon depicting the head of King Charles laying next to his crown with the quote, "You are not our king." Senator Thorpe later removed the post and took to Instagram to post an apology, saying it was a member of staff who shared the image without her knowledge. She went on to write she would never share anything to encourage violence. Joining me now is senior ABC News anchor and correspondent who has covered Indigenous affairs. That's Dan Borsha. Dan, thank you for joining us on BBC News. Now, Lidia Thorpe was talking about a treaty relating to Indigenous people. For our audience, just explain a little bit more about what that treaty is.
Anita, good to be with you. Well, this is something that Senator Thorpe has called for the entire time that she's been a member of the Australian Senate. And that's really a calling for a treaty or a compact between the governments, both federal, state and territory, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nation groups. And Anita, of course, there are more than 250 individual Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups across the nation. So the question is often asked whether or not it would be individual treaties with individual nations and just how that would be carried out. But nevertheless, this is something that Senator Thorpe says needs to be happened to correct what she says was a huge mistake at the time of colonisation that has put Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the back foot for the hundreds of years since. And she says that this is simply about righting or beginning to right those wrongs of the past.
And Australia is the only former British colony without a treaty like this, as I understand it. Now, this treaty, if it happened, that would be different to the Voice to Parliament referendum, which, again, I'll get you to explain this in a little bit more detail. That would have established a formal body for Indigenous people, but without as many powers, perhaps, as a treaty would enshrine?
Well, this is a really interesting thing. I mean, the point that you make, Anita, initially about Australia being the only Commonwealth nation without a treaty is absolutely correct, and is a peculiarity of history and one that many still scratch their heads about. But last year we had a vote for a referendum for a voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. That was defeated overwhelmingly by 60%. But curiously, that came about as a result of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people gathering on Arrernte Country at Uluru in the very centre of Australia. And what came out of that gathering, which of course was preceded by about a dozen other meetings, was a call for voice, treaty, then truth in that order. So a voice mechanism to have voices heard by politicians without any formal powers, but really being a way to connect the most remote and isolated parts of this nation to the policymakers in Canberra where this incident unfolded, followed by a treaty and a mechanism to be able to develop treaties between the layers of government and the First Nations groups, and then truth or makarata, which is really about coming together. It's a Yolngu term from Arnhem Land, about coming together after conflict and finding a way forward. So those were the three parts of the Uluru Statement from the Heart that really was aimed at shifting the die on what has become, for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, quite a hopeless situation where Aboriginal people are some of the most incarcerated on the planet, whereas we heard from Senator Thorpe, there are many, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have died in custody, and those questions have not been answered, and that's just some of the issues that have arisen, she says, because of that unfinished business.
And as I understand it, only a treaty is acceptable to her because she says it's legally binding, it's a negotiated agreement. As for this specific protest, just give us your thoughts, Dan, on the impact it's making and how it might influence the debate on the future of the monarchy there in Australia.
Well, it's a really interesting point, Anita. I mean, it's leading your news bulletin and bulletins right around the globe. So if this was about drawing attention to the plight of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, you'd have to say that by that measure, it's succeeded because the world is talking about the senator who confronted the King in the Great Hall of the Australian Parliament earlier today. Now, whether or not that leads to substantive change remains to be seen. Senator Thorpe has said that this was for her about truth-telling on a global stage, that it's about shining a huge spotlight on the issues that she has been speaking about for many years, if not decades, in fact. And there remains to be seen of whether there will be moves by this federal government, given that we have an election in the coming months, on those issues around treaty and truth. And the second part you asked about there, really around the future of the monarchy. As you know, that is sometimes a live question in Australia, so close to the failed referendum last year. And being the person that covered that and travelled the country doing so. I can't see a federal government wanting to go to the polls on a question of not only changing the constitution but changing our entire system of government unless there was locked in bipartisan support, because what we now know is absolutely clear that Australians will not vote for change if there is not that absolute support of both political parties. So you'd have to think that any discussions about moving away from the monarchy and becoming a republic were certainly set back by last year and isn't something that's going to be on the agenda for many years, if at all, into the future.
OK, Dan, good to get your expertise on this. Dan Borscher.